Okay, well, let's make a start. I hope you can all hear me and can see the slides. So thank you for coming today to this Dementia Open Forum. Um, I thought today I'd give a quick overview of studies we've been conducting and we're currently conducting on driving in aging and dementia, which is a big topic. And so it caused a lot of interest, and it's still, there's so much to do in this area, which is really great to work in it because what we're doing has real relevance for people out there. So I've cheekily called it, Are We There Yet? Driving and Aging and Dementia. So, and as always, we're sponsored by the East Network of Alzheimer's Research UK. Let's start then with some background in aging and driving. And most of you will know that we live in an aging society. So this is the Office for National Statistics showing the population for women and men from ages 0 to 109. And the distribution we're having at the moment, this is 2018. And what you can see in yellow is the line which will be the increase of the population by 2043. So in particular, the older population will really increase in our nation. So that puts lots of pressures, of course, on health services, as you all know about this, I'm pretty sure. But it also means that more and more people keep living independently and are driving. And that's really reflected by the number of older people with a full driving license that's been rising for the last few years and has continued to rise. So we have a larger population of older people who drive to quite a high age. And that is not surprising because by surveys, for example, by the Department for Transport, older people rated the importance of driving very high. So the rated it from 1, which is not important at all, to 10, which is very important. And you can see that most people in this large survey rated 5 and above for driving. So it's a really important aspect for people to continue driving. And of course, the reason for this is that driving is so important for maintaining our independence, accessing services, seeing friends, loads of kind of social, but also service kind of provision is really important that we have access to via the car to go to places. So next question one can ask is, so what makes people actually stop driving when they age? And one of the most important factors is age itself. So these are in blue, it shows people who are still driving, and in red, people who have stopped driving. And what you can see is that in particular, people age 80 and over, there's then more and more people stop driving than continue driving. What it shows is that really most people self-regulate already their driving. They know that maybe they've not been as good as a driver as they were previously, and therefore they consider either reducing their driving or stopping driving altogether. Reducing driving is a tricky thing because the less you practice, of course, the worse you become. It's the classic use it or lose it. We always say, and the same applies for driving. If you talk to the professionals who do the driving assessments, they always encourage people to drive, to continue driving regularly. But if you feel clearly not you sure anymore whether you should drive, then that's already a sign that maybe you should stop driving. Now, the interesting aspect for this is as well where people live and whether they stop driving. And this looks again at drivers and people who stop driving for, it is again, this is the UK data, whether they live in the city, a town, in a suburban area, or a rural or village location. And what you can see for town and suburban, there seems to be not much a difference between the two groups. But for the city, what's really important is that more people are happy to stop driving than continue driving. And that is very often because cities can be more stressful places to drive with rush hour traffic, which is not pleasant for anybody. But it also means that, of course, there are many more public transport links in cities. In contrast, in rural or village settings, people actually are reluctant to stop driving. So that more people continue driving and stopping driving. And the reason really for this is, of course, that public transport links in rural or village locations can be very challenging. And therefore, having a car can be is really important to still access services or being as independent as possible. So the location matters as well, not only age. And another aspect which is really important is also deprivation, which again shows for the middle ranges, not much a difference, but for people who are most deprived, so poorest, to least deprived to richest, there is a big difference that people who are most deprived are more likely to stop driving. And the reasons for this are again varied, but very likely to costs because, of course, driving a car, maintaining a car can be quite costly. While for the people who are least deprived, they continue driving. And so there are more people continuing driving than stopping driving. So it's important to get this context right, that it matters, not only the age matters, but also the context where people live and their socioeconomic background, whether people consider stopping driving. Now, one of the other key aspects is, of course, accidents in driving and aging. And that is a really important topic because data from the Department for Transport shows clearly what we would call a U-shaped curve. So these are the drivers in collisions per billion vehicle miles traveled. And what you can see at the bottom is the age ranges, so 17 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 35, and so on, up to 86 plus. And in a way, it's not surprising that people below the age of 25 have some of the highest rates of collisions in road traffic accidents. And we all know about this, and insurances know all about this. But the other often surprising element for people is that people over 75 or 80 have actually even higher rates of collisions per miles traveled. And this is quite interesting because in general, older people drive less than younger people. So that's very well documented. But if they travel, they're at a much higher risk of having a collision. So even if you drive very little, if you go above these age ranges, the numbers are pretty clear that there are many, many more casualties above that, especially 75, 80 once you go above that. And which kind of locations does this happen? So this is the Department of Transport divides in motorway traffic from urban traffic from rural traffic. And this is just the traffic in general, how much percentage is there in general traffic. So 43% rural traffic, 41% urban traffic, 17% is on the motorway. Now, for older people, where do they have most of the accidents? Is pretty clear that most accidents happen in rural areas. There are very few accidents, this is for older people specifically, happen on motorways because most older drivers would avoid dual carriageways on motorways and don't drive them as much. Well, for the younger population, the accidents on motorways are much, much higher, and the biggest actually part of accidents are in urban areas. But what we can see for older people in particular, the rural areas are really important. And we know already, of course, that many people move to rural locations when they retire. So it is a kind of a conundrum we're having therefore, that people live rurally but still need to drive because there's no public transport, but they're at a higher risk actually of having collisions living rurally. Why that is, we can discuss this, but the exact reason is not known. The other situation we need to think about in accidents are what kind of driving situations have the most accidents for each age group. And this looks at driver age here from 18 until 80. And it looks at different kind of when accident happened. For example, on a bend, turning right, slowing or stopping, overtaking, changing lane. You can see most of them have quite an even distribution until the age of 50-ish. But above 60 then, in particular, turning right becomes very, the numbers of accidents become much higher for the older people. And it's really one of the key driving situations, where a lot of accidents happen. You might remember when Prince Philip was still alive and he had this accident driving out of Sandringham Castle, out of the driveway onto the main road, which goes to King's Lynn. He did a right turn and was basically hit by a car which come the other way. So it's a very typical situation which many older drivers face. And again, we can discuss why that is the case. So, as with so many things in life, it's this critical balance between independence and safety we have to struggle with driving and aging in general. That we want to keep our independence, but at the same time, we need to be careful that we might have a reduced safety and at a higher risk of having accidents. And of course, the government and the Department for Transport and the DVLA are really very much aware of this. And hence, they, of course, introduced license renewals from the age of 70, and which are every 3 years, the licenses are renewed. And people, basically, it's clear whether people want to renew it. Either they're self-regulated and say, I'm not going to renew it anymore, I'm not feeling safe anymore, or they develop conditions like dementia, which we come to later on, which might change how they drive. Interestingly, the vast majority of aspects that are looked at for driving in aging are physical and visual changes. And physical is, for example, can people still turn their head to do looking over their shoulder if traffic is coming? And many people, or can they still move in the car? And people, for example, who have arthritis might be more hindered in being able to move. The same, of course, visually. So many people will have visual conditions like macular degeneration, and they will really affect how people see where traffic is coming from. What's less really understood is how cognition or our thinking processes really impact on driving. There is some knowledge out there, but it's not as well established as we would think. And that's quite surprising because cognition is quite important for many driving behaviors. So, for example, reaction time, sudden braking, adequate responses to traffic signs and lights, to understand or remember the traffic signs, turns or intersections, speed control, response to distractions or failure to recognize landmarks or signs are really important via all these cognitive processes. So how fast we process information, how how we respond to distractions, our memory for routes, how do we basically manage intersections, which can be very complex, and our visual spatial ability. We are particularly interested as well in another set of driving behavior changes, for example, following too close, lane maintenance, lane changing, and unfamiliar route following, which are more about spatial orientation and spatial navigation, which is even less tested very often in driving assessments of fitness to drive. So you can see there's a whole range of driving behaviors that might change in aging and dementia. But at the moment, the vast majority of testing is based on whether people are physically able to drive and whether they have the visual, whether they can see things. But their cognitive element is much less explored. So based on that, we designed a study called the Decision Study. Well, it's finished now, but it was called the Decision Study. which was funded by the Department for Transport and also supported by the Erland Stewart Charitable Trust and the NHS or NHR Applied Research Collaboration East of England, and it involved Dr. Mary Fisher Morris, who is a psychologist who sits actually on one of the parliamentary steering groups for driving, Stephen Jeffs, who was a research assistant, now left for Exeter, and Sol Morrissey, who's a PhD student working on this project. And the objectives were really to establish how driving behavior differs across different cognitive profiles with a healthy older adult cohort, so these are only healthy people. Assess how the cognitive changes interact with driving behavior over time, and develop normative data that be compared with dementia patients. So this was very important for us that we actually, because there's so little normative data, so very large data out there for cognition and driving, we wanted to create a very large database which we can use then for comparing people with dementia who have cognitive changes against. And what did we do? So we had these different cognitive components I already talked about. So speed of processing, attention, memory, executive function, visual spatial ability, spatial orientation, which all tap into different aspects of driving behavior. And then we wanted to look at how people actually, how does this relate to people's driving? So we ran this study. In the end, it recruited just over 1,000 people, which is great. And they had a mean age of 71, but we had age range from 65 all the way until 90. Around 50% were female, so that was great. We had a good gender split. They were in general fairly educated, with 14 years of average education. Driving experience, you can see they had 49 years of driving experience on average. So very, very experienced people in terms of driving. And we also checked how many days they drove still per week. And they drove on average 4 days a week. So people still fairly drive a lot in that sense. And not every day, but nearly every other day. And we were also quite fortunate that we had a very good geographical distribution across the different regions in England and also urban and rural areas. So we gave people some questionnaires where we asked them about some demographic information like their age and their background in general. Then we asked about their health, which health conditions they currently have. We asked about the driving history quite a lot in detail, how many times they get, how many years they've been driving, how long, how many, for example, incidents or accidents they had, whether they consider themselves to be still good drivers, and so on. And then we also asked them to report on their cognition, how they thought their cognition was. And then we did a whole cognitive battery online. All of these, actually, the questionnaires and the battery was all done online, where we did various ranges of tests which tapped into these different cognitive domains that I talked about earlier. So what did we find, really? We first looked at the self-reported driving behavior, and we want to really look at driving frequency, how much people drive, how many weekly trips they do. We also want to look at a driving space. Do they, for example, just drive in the immediate neighborhood, or do people still do long distance or anything in between? And we looked at situations which were we know already driving difficult, for example, driving at night, driving alone, dual carriageways, all these situations where we know already all the people in general report that they're finding them harder. And the driving difficulty in particular was associated with a longer processing speed, so being slightly slower to process this information, poorer memory and poorer spatial orientation. And avoiding challenging situations was associated particularly with poorer spatial orientation. So, for example, parallel parking, I think many people would avoid this anyway as a challenging situation. And I'm not sure how much this is still done, but clearly people avoided this if they have poorer spatial orientation. But also the turning cross traffic, like we talked about before, the turning right was really, and we know this is of course a very common scenario for accidents, was related to poorer spatial orientation. So that was a really important finding, because so far there were not really good cognitive markers for what predicts that people actually, how well they do driving wise. And these spatial orientation changes were similar in under and over 70-year-olds. We were particularly interested in the threshold of 70 because this is what the current guidelines are for license renewal, actually. Then we ask ourselves, well, if there people have these spatial orientation changes, can actually SatNav help with that? SatNav these days we have many people use it now these days in their cars. In most cars these days, it's built in already, or people have still holders for their mobile, like we do in our family car. So if people struggle with the spatial orientation, if they use these devices, can it actually help them? So as part of the decision study, we explored that. And first, we wanted to find out how many people actually use it. And actually, the vast majority of people older drivers use SatNav during driving. So it's very popular as a tool to use. The vast majority use it only on journeys to a new destination. And frankly, personally, that's how I would use it as well. But many use it also journeys along a familiar route, maybe just to have it on and backing themselves up. New routes to a familiar destination was the next one. Some people use it as backup in case of forgetting a route, and of course when lost on a new route. But this was much smaller numbers for this. And interestingly, the people who use GPS or SatNavs, they had higher number of driving days and trips per week, and they had a higher typical annual mileage and a much greater driving space, and rated themselves as better drivers. So that was a clear indication that GPS can help really people, or SatNav can really help people being actually more independent, having a much wider radius and being much more engaged and feeling actually more confident as well as drivers. Even more importantly, we found that people who had spatial orientation changes on our measures, who used GPS, they also had a much higher driving frequency and great mileage. So even if you maybe are struggling with some of these cognitive changes, using a SatNav can really help people to drive still quite frequently and with a greater mileage. We don't, of course, know at the moment if they're driving safer because of that. That would be another study to conduct, but it's an interesting finding that we can definitely increase people's driving frequency and greater mileage by using SatNavs. So from the decision study, the conclusion is that spatial orientation deficits offer a robust cognitive indicator for driving impairment across older age. Older adults with spatial orientation deficit may be at greater risk for road traffic incidents. This is something we are exploring now. And the SatNav technology might alleviate some of those spatial orientation deficits and might therefore really help people staying more independent. And because it's so widely used and very accepted, it might really help people. And these deficits may explain the increased risk for road traffic incidents amongst people with dementia. So what I haven't mentioned yet is that spatial orientation or spatial disorientation is very common in people who have dementia. And this can range from people being just slightly disoriented, not sure which day or where they are, ranging all the way to getting lost when going out on outings. So again, we therefore wanted to have a look at how does this actually affect people with dementia. So I'm switching now to the dementia side. So we've done a whole study on aging and aging drivers, which really allowed us this. But in dementia, of course, is another critical aspect for and driving. So people with dementia must legally report their condition to the DVLA and also notify the insurance of their diagnosis. And this is really important that you do that, so you can be fined. So by law, you must report it. Usually people report to their GP as a first point of call to assess the fitness to drive. But what we know and what many GPs tell us is it's highly variable how fitness to drive is assessed by GPs. And on top of that, many GPs are reluctant to discuss the topic. Now, the poor GPs, they always get the short stick. So we don't want to blame on this, because the reasons they're discussing, they're reluctant to discuss this, is that the GPs themselves feel they get a lack of good quality training and knowledge of the laws and resources that are out there for driving in dementia in particular. They're also worried that it can affect the doctor-patient relationship, because, of course, telling somebody that they might consider stopping driving can be very upsetting for people. And many people with dementia challenge this decision, and sometimes rightly so. And therefore, the doctor-patient relationship can be affected by this. The GPs also say that it's very difficult for them to determine the benefit versus the risk of driving cessation, so whether people should stop driving. And this is clearly, again, this independence versus safety kind of discussion. When should people continue driving? When should they stop? The other thing that GPs always report is that they are uncertain of the optimal time or disease stage for this decision making. When should they have this conversation with people, or when should they assess them whether they should continue driving? Now, in general, and this is a very broad general kind of summary, it differs from individual to individual, and I'll come back to this in a second, is that driving, usually in the early stages of dementia, most people are fine to continue to drive. And that's good news. And most people, when they get a diagnosis of dementia, they're afraid that they have to stop driving. And for some people, that will be the case because of their symptoms. But for other people, they might still continue drive at that stage safely, even if they undergo a driving assessment with an instructor and so on. With the moderate disease stages, it's less likely that they can continue driving. And that's where really the difficulty starts. When should people stop driving? When should they continue driving? And again, the context matters there a lot. Do they live rurally? Does the partner drive? Do they have a partner? It makes a huge difference. And with the severe stages, virtually no person continues to drive with dementia, because the changes to the brain are just too big that people can manage still, even getting the car going. But what it shows you, and this is just a cartoon, that we have these healthy people with mild cognitive impairment and people with dementia, and whether they can continue driving depends really a lot on the individual as well. As I've shown, these are just different, how people would progress in the disease. And again, it's just a cartoon. These are not real people, but it shows you that different people, they might need to stop driving at different stages during the disease. So it's important to remember that BOF is just a generalization across the disease stages. But the risk factors for driving cessation, this is from a ProDerm study, is that more advanced stages of dementia, as I said before, that they usually have higher everyday function impairments, so they really struggle with everyday functions in general. The type of dementia can make a difference. So especially when people have more behavior changes, they usually stop driving earlier than people who have maybe Alzheimer's disease, where the memory is mostly affected, and people with memory deficits are usually okay with mild memory deficits to continue driving. And the study found as well that female people would stop driving earlier. Why that is, again, we don't know. Are women more sensible than men to stop driving, or are women driving less than men at that age group? And then various reasons for this. But it just shows you, again, these risk factors will affect when the individual might be unable to stop driving. The main reason for driving cessation is the carer or family concern. So very often the family or the carer who reports these kind of, and talks to the doctor and is concerned about that. And that starts the conversation. The others are, of course, accidents. It's pretty obvious once there's a severe accident. But I think the more interesting ones are smaller incidents or near misses. that are very often. So with near misses, of course, we know that can be quite a shock, and this might trigger people to consider stop driving. Incidents can be anything, can be even just hitting the bins on the driveway or hitting the garage door while on the parking on the driveway, or scraping the car along some, is always an indicator that something's changed. The other main reason is being told to stop driving. However, 1 in 3 individuals continue to drive even after told to stop driving, and it just shows you how important driving is for people. And that can be a real challenge because, of course, your insurance might be invalid, and it also can affect the safety of other road users. So many times I hear people say, well, I just drive locally, I just drive very slow. But I always say then, well, just imagine it is school run time and a child is running out on the road. One just doesn't want to think about the consequences, even if you just go locally and very slow. And people with dementia have 5 times greater risk of motor vehicle collisions than healthy older individuals of the same age. So the risk is hugely increased. So we're running at the moment an follow-up on the decision study called the INDICATE study, and this is run by Ellen Buscher. She's a research assistant, and in collaboration with Driving Mobility. Driving Mobility are the provider of the driving assessments for the DVLA, and Danny Wilson and Anu Vajne are from Driving Mobility and helping us with this. They're actually practitioners who assess people with dementia all the time for their driving. So that's really great. And this is funded by the Road Safety Trust and also the NHR. And that study is really taking what we've used now from our healthy people and do the same in people with dementia. So assessing their cognition, but also looking at the impact on driving. And we really want to determine the feasibility of online cognitive testing in mild cognitive impairment and early dementia by the nationwide driving mobility driving assessment centers. So we're using the main driving assessment centers, such as shown in blue, and the Northern Ireland one in green. So there's 17 where people are assessed, and we're recruiting across all these centers. And we want to compare our cognitive test against what currently people are using in those assessment centers, which actually varies a lot which cognitive tests are used. Some use a lot, some use very little cognitive testing. And we also want to see how does it compare to the on-road assessment. So people undergo an on-road assessment of those driving assessment centers by a driving instructor. We want to see how does the cognitive changes relate to that. And we want to also see how this relates then to historic and future road traffic incident risk. So how these cognitive changes doesn't really increase people's risk. So the individuals with MCI and dementia attend these centers and will complete the current gold standard cognitive test measures and on-road assessment. And then they will be invited to use our own cognitive assessments, and we're trying to get around 400 people. And then we will follow them up after a 12-month period and retest them again to see how they're doing. So the potential outcomes is that what we're hoping from this is to get improved cognitive testing for people undergoing driving assessments. So cognitive results better relate to the driving assessment, and hopefully we can better predict driving safety. And interestingly, cognitive testing can be conducted from home or there. So hopefully there's a better experience for the client. They have more time for the teams at driving mobility to focus on driving assessment, and therefore save time as well. And the fitness to drive and cognitive changes. So which stage is when to best assess, and the longitudinal changes in terms of follow-up. Now, this study really just started. Well, it started actually in April, but we started recruitment only recently. And so I don't have any results yet, but I will let you know what comes of it when we have findings. But I want to mention the final study, the SENSOR study. And this is really run by my PhD student Sol and my RA Rachel. This is interestingly Rachel's profile photo of the university. So Rachel, if you're listening, we need to update that. Now the SENSOR study is similar. It follows a much smaller group of people up. And we really want to understand on how these cognitive changes influence real-world driving behavior in people who are aging and dementia, and establish then how the brain changes for dementia relate to driving behavior, and explore which environmental characteristics may lead to particular at-risk driving events in individuals who have these cognitive changes. So we do our cognitive testing. We do our brain imaging, where we're actually checking which areas of the brain might be related. And then we're also looking at the real world, how people are driving in different scenarios. And we're doing that via fitting a sensor in people's cars. And these sensors are really now everywhere, frankly, and they are fantastic because instead of just asking people how they drive or they have to undergo a driving assessment, we can just use this sensor to actually see how people drive and whether they are safe drivers or not. Now, they're currently not used for driving assessment, but we think it's worth exploring how they relate actually to the cognitive changes. So I just show you some example data from somebody, which a colleague sent me actually, for these sensors. So this is the journey somebody is traveling with a sensor in the car. This is the start of the journey. This is the end of the journey. And what you can see in orange, this is the speed limit in the different aspects of where they drove along. So this is 30 mile, 50 mile, and this is 70 mile speed limit. And in blue, you have this actual speed of the person driving. And in green, you have the sensor measures how fast you accelerate or brake. And in red, you have how much you steer, or basically. And what you can see, this is a healthy older person, and they drive, I guess, like most of us do. We go along the speed limit, and then we stop sometimes when we need to go, of course, at the crossing. And then sometimes we go a little bit over the speed limit and we think, oh, I'm going too fast. Oh, I better go a bit slower. And then we go a bit. And so we go along this line of the speed limit all the time. But what you can see, the green and the red dots, they are pretty even. They stay pretty similar. So this person drives very smoothly, doesn't brake harsh, doesn't accelerate harsh, doesn't steer erratically. Now, somebody with dementia is a different journey, of course, they're driving here. Again, you would have here the speed limit, again, shown for this journey. Now, have a look at the speed. And the first thing you notice, this person goes far below the speed limit all the time. So they're going much, much slower because they're already maybe not quite sure how to drive. The other thing, notice the dots, how distributed they are. It shows much more that they're braking, accelerating, and steering is much more abrupt than the person here, who's much smoother, where they all are pretty much aligned. So here they vary much more. So it's one really aspect we want to look at in the future, which we think is really relevant. So we're looking really for people for age 65 and above, who are healthy people, but also people with MCI and early dementia. And at the research appointment, we ask people, we take some physical measurements like your heart rate and blood pressure and demographics. We also do the cognitive testing. And then we also do the MRI scan. And then we put a sensor into your car and also give you a driving diary to note any unusual events that might have happened, which might have influenced it. And then we retest people at 12 months. I just highlight this because, again, this is a study we're still recruiting for. So we need you if you want to take part or you know anybody. We're looking in particular for people with MCI and early dementia. We can't tell from this data whether you're fit to drive or not, but we really need your help to understand much better whether these kind of measures really help us. So take-home messages. I think driving is important for older people and those with dementia to keep their independence, clearly. However, older people have some of the highest rates of road fatalities, and we can't brush over that. Cognitive changes such as reaction time, processing speed, and spatial orientation emerge as critical to maintain a safe driver during aging. This comes on top, of course, of the physical, that you're physically healthy and that your eyesight is intact. in particular, what I found really fascinating, the spatial orientation difficulties might be alleviated by using sat-nav during driving. So it might really help you, actually. Cognitive changes in dementia can significantly affect driving safety. And currently, but it's not currently clear which cognitive changes and which level of cognitive changes might warrant that you undergo a fitness to drive assessment. So this is really where our indicate in our census study coming through, that we're really exploring that in much more detail. As I said, they have 5 times risk compared to somebody who's healthy and older to have a collision if you have dementia. So indicate and sensor, as I said, are investigating this, and we're really looking for people. And hopefully in the future, I can update you on the progress of those studies, which we think will hopefully inform. I think in particular indicate we're very excited to be partnering with Driving Mobility, because that we can inform future driving assessments to have a much more standardized cognitive assessment maybe across these centers if the study is successful. And also this might hopefully influence the policy, so to make it much clearer what measures people should use when they undergo driving assessments. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions either in person or via the chat. I stopped sharing. I put my email address later again on, so don't worry if you can't catch it now. But if you want to come on now and ask me any questions or put them in the chat is there's a chat symbol at the bottom of the screen. You can type your chat question there. Don't be shy. Okay. Thank you very much, Annelies. I'm glad you like it. I think, yeah, what I've noticed that driving clearly is of great interest to many, many people, and people have very strong opinions about it. I found that out very, very quickly. And I always say, if I have to talk to my own father about stopping to drive, I think I would avoid that conversation as well. But it's a really important aspect, I think, that driving is so important to have this independence, but also safety. How can people join the sensor study? That's an excellent question. Yes, I should have put that actually down. So what you can do, you can just email us on, I just put the email address here for the study. This is the sensor study email address, but or you just contact us via the UEA dementia website, and if you send us an email about that, we can forward it. Thank you both. Yeah, there's another question. So, and then we can check the eligibility. George, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Yes. Basically, I would just want to say I know people who have dementia, whose GPs have taken a very aggressive stance and reported them even without telling them that they were going to. So they lost their license totally unexpectedly. And I mean, one I remember was given a note to hold. He dropped it by accident, and the doctor said, "Well, you've dropped that piece of paper, therefore you can't drive." It really does need standardizing in some way. I think what you just explained is really interesting.
Thank you, George. Well, I'm glad it's interesting. Yes, I agree. I think at the moment we're doing this, of course, not with GPs. I think this is the next step for us. After we have so many studies ongoing now, but after the indicate and the sensor studies, and we're talking to the driving mobility, we're talking to GPs, because exactly I think that's where most people would go as in the first instance. And how driving fitness is assessed in GPs is very variable. And as you say, some people take a much stronger approach, some a much softer approach. it just needs to be much more transparent what's happening. And the GPs are obliged by law to report it, but they should tell the person with dementia or their family that they have reported it. So yeah, that's just to clarify that point. But I take your point. Again, I don't want to blame the GPs. They have a lot on their plate always to deal with things, but we need clearly much better guidance and guidelines for GPs. Okay, Ryan, I come back to you. I just ask Gail some questions on. So, do poor rates of formal dementia diagnosis impact your research? Yes, I think clearly that people sometimes do not have, but I think you don't need necessarily to have a dementia diagnosis, even if you just have cognitive impairment or mild cognitive impairment. You can take part, and that clearly, so you don't need necessarily a formal diagnosis of dementia, but we prefer it, obviously. And we would test you as well to see how you perform. Then Kate is asking, how does it work with car insurance? When is a person with dementia covered until? Well, they are covered if you inform the insurance and you let them know that there is a condition, and the insurance will very likely send you a letter, and whether you're covered and continue to be covered, or whether they want to change your premium. And that's, of course, up to the insurer to decide that. The important thing is to report it instantly, because then, as I said, if anything happens and the car insurance was not aware, it might, yeah, as I said, you don't want to have no cover on your car insurance, clearly. But it's a tricky situation. And again, the insurers at the moment, we tried to talk to some of the insurers, but they want to see how first these studies work, in particular with the driving assessment centers. But very likely they are very interested also in a much better standardization of the research. Okay, Rian, do you want to ask your question?
Well, it's not so much a question as an observation.
Yeah.
So I've been going back and forth from California to UK for the past 3 years because of my father. So I'm here because of my father, but I found this extremely interesting because I'm in my 60s and I would have to turn right out my father's driveway in a rural location.
I
I
hope I didn't
lost
scare you
count.
now.
I lost count of how many near misses I had, and it was a 60-mile-hour speed limit. It was absolutely madness. I would do everything. I'd have the windows rolled down and carefully come up. It was just, yeah, very aggressive drivers in the country.
Yeah, I think that's the rural location, and as I said, the turning. It's a classic example. So just be careful. And I think for your father, clearly, when he does this as well, it can be really, really challenging, and can be this classic what's called T-boning, that other cars just hit you sideways, and that can lead to quite severe injuries as well. Yeah.
Well, luckily, my father stopped driving, I don't
Ah.
know, 10, 15 years ago, and I had his car towed this year. So, yeah, driving is finished.
Oh dear. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, Mike is asking, so Mike, you have early stage dementia and being informed by the DVLA that they can no longer drive, but we haven't been given a reason really. We assume he will not be able to take part in the study. Yes, unfortunately, if you cannot drive any more longer, then unfortunately you can't take part in the study anymore, because we need people to drive to understand what's happened. But I think if you want to get in touch with us and my research assistant, especially Rachel, we can explore if there are other options for you to take part. June, thank you, Michael. Yeah, certainly clarified so well for us. The various experts will consider when you continue to drive. Yes, well, I hope so. I hope it's not only bad news. That's the thing. I think Adrian is asking, thank you for this. Sorry to digress, but may I ask if there will be an update on the ABCD study? If so, when? Thanks. Well, I'm not lead on the ABCD study, so I'm afraid I don't know. So if you ask again, if you email the general UVA dementia research, we can forward the request to the person in charge and they can answer it. I'm sorry, I can't give you any more information on that. And Sam is asking, do you think it could also influence government to make better transport networks in rural areas so people could choose to stop sooner if they started to notice changes rather than have to struggle to continue longer than they want to? Yes. Well, I think how much time you have. Of course, closure of rural public transport has been going on for the last decades in this country. Less and less services. And this is not only the recent government, of course, as you know, in the 1960s or 70s, all the small rail tracks were closed, which were connecting villages. Bus services now these days are really challenged. And I don't know, I hope the government, with not going ahead with HS2, really puts this money into better public transport for rural areas. But I can see why people are desperate, because if you live in a rural location which has a bus twice a day, it's very, very difficult to go anywhere with that. And so I think I really hope there should be much better investment in this. Maybe we need to have different approaches. Yeah. Also, Sam is also thinking about how some difficulties might transfer to using mobility scooter. Yes, so loads of people use mobility scooter, and driving mobility also does assessments for mobility scooters and does training for mobility scooters. So it's a different aspect of it. We haven't looked at mobility scooters and dementia. This is another aspect we could look at. I've just said training. So this is an aspect driving mobility offers as well. You can pay to do to take, well, not driving lessons, but I think it's a booster kind of training to improve your driving, and that's really, really good. And driving mobility, they always say they want to keep people as independent as possible. So safe and independent, that's for them really a key aspect. Jack and Catherine ask, is there some insurance companies who are more understanding of dementia and will look at the whole person, just look at the word dementia and put a premium up? I'm afraid I don't know. It's a really good question. I've tried to have locally a conversation with Aviva, but so far we have no luck. Clearly, insurance companies are very protective of their algorithms, how they calculate their premiums. And I don't know is the short answer therefore how they would calculate it. But it's definitely worth having a conversation or maybe having a look around if there are maybe specialist providers. George is again, what's the email for the census study? Or maybe I'll put that in again here underneath. Census study. Here we go. Oh, no, he's gone already. Never mind. Hopefully he can find it. And Kate, again, I've worked previously in a rural setting where the community set up their own volunteer driver service to take the locals to appointments, which worked really well. I know work in a town and there's nothing like that. Yes, that's brilliant, of course. If really, you know, the rural or the village is really coming together and does this. Should it be up to the village to sort this out, or should it be the government is the other question then? But clearly, if you have a setting which allows you that, that's great. And in towns, it can be more anonymous, but very often, of course, the public transport links are better. But it's a great question, whether this would actually help people. And Annalise, so my father had to stop driving due to visual problems, but his beloved car sat on the driveway for a year before he could bear to part with it. Was giving up his independence was so hard. Yes, it is heartbreaking, literally, for many people to give up driving, especially when they love driving. And we had, for example, people who were you know, for example, they were professional drivers. They drove for a living, and they were very, very experienced people. You know, and for them to give up and understand that they cannot is very difficult. We had even some former race drivers, race car drivers, which is very interesting. Maybe not the most secure way of driving, but clearly very, very good drivers. And it's for everybody. It's a really, really difficult decision. As I said, in particular, if people live alone, can make a huge difference, or if their partner really hasn't really driven a lot or is not confident as a driver, it can make also a huge difference. It's another aspect to look into. Right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground. Charlie, could I ask you please to put in the Dementia UEA email address and the link again? So you can contact us if you have any questions. You can email us just to the UEA Dementia. Yes, there it is. Thank you, Charlie. So there is our YouTube page where all our talks are recorded and you can access them. There's our email address, dementia.research@uea.ac.uk. And from that you can get distributed to any of the dementia research that is happening at UEA and our website. Yeah. Well, we come to the end of the hour. And so thank you so much for coming and hopefully see you the next time. Thank you.